Hey, I'm Andrew with 10-Minute Therapy, and today we're going to continue our look at some cognitive behavioral therapy techniques with a really fundamental topic. The topic we're going to look at is the difference between fact and opinion. It's a very simple topic, but it's actually very fundamentally important that we learn the difference between this two and how to utilize them well in our own thinking. So, without further ado, let's start the clock and we'll get right to it. So, when we look at cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of what we're doing is examining our own thinking. Over the last few videos, we've looked at things like cognitive distortions, unhealthy thinking patterns. But at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is learn how do we rewire our thinking. Our last video, I highly recommend you give it a listen because it's really starting to examine exactly how we go about changing the way we think. And so for today's video, we're going to examine the difference between facts and opinions. Now that might sound overly simplistic. It might sound like something childish even. You might think to yourself, I very much know the difference between a fact and an opinion. However, it's not that we don't know the difference between facts and opinions. The issue that we run into is that we don't know how to utilize them correctly. So, when we examine facts and opinions, the first thing that we need to do is to begin to define them. Now, interestingly, even when I've worked with children as young as 6 years old, they have an understanding of the difference between a fact and an opinion. This is an exercise I've used with kids as young as 6, 7, or 8, all the way up through working with adults. And the difference between fact and opinion, at least in terms of a definition, is pretty simple. We know that a fact is something that is always true. It's true whether I believe it or not. It's true whether I examine it or not. It's true because it is. It is unwavering, unchanging. It is always true. But an opinion is totally different. An opinion is something that all of us have. An opinion is how I feel about something. It's my perspective of a topic, an issue, an idea. And so the difference between the two couldn't be farther apart. Facts are always true. Opinions change constantly. Opinions can be informed by my experiences, my culture, my perspective. All sorts of different things can change my opinions. And so again, most people, even young children, know the difference when I ask them, what's the difference between a fact and an opinion? So knowing the difference, that's only the first part. Once we have those definitions down and we can sort of regularly agree, I've not had anyone argue with me about the difference between a fact and an opinion. The problem becomes, if we know the difference between a fact and an opinion, then why is it that our own perspective of ourselves, our opinions of who we are often held in our mind as if they are factual? Let me give you an example of what I mean. Oftentimes in the therapy process, when I start to work with individuals, we start to examine things like what someone believes about themselves. And through the counseling process, through questions and discussions, I will start to hear people say things like, I'm a failure. I'm not good enough. I always mess up. I can't do this. And people say these things about themselves as if they are facts, when in reality, they are just negative opinions about ourselves. So let's take this first one that I mentioned, for example. When someone has this opinion about themselves, I'm a failure. The interesting thing is that is definitely an opinion. It's not a factual statement. It's not always true. It's their perspective of themselves. It's one's view of who they are and how they see themselves. But the problem is when someone believes I'm a failure, and then I come along as a counselor, a therapist, and I say, well, I don't believe that's true. I think you've had some great success in your life. The truth is the person probably doesn't believe me when I say that. They're going to say, well, that's just your opinion, but I know that it's true. I'm a failure. Here's all the reasons I'm a failure. I've messed up here in my job, or I made these mistakes in the past, or my spouse is always upset with me over this. And so they start to look at these very negative inferences and examples, and they draw this conclusion that it is a fact that I'm a failure. There again, when we look at the difference in the definitions between a fact and an opinion, the reality is my view of myself as a failure is strictly an opinion, and it's a very negative one at that. And I want to go back. I'm going to take this piece of yarn here to something we discussed in our last video, right? The neurons in our brains connect when we repeat something. So when an individual says to themselves, I'm a failure, they've started to create a neural connection, a chain link between several neurons. And every time they think that thought again, they start to reinforce and reinforce. I'm a failure because I messed up at work. I'm a failure because of my relationship with my parents. My kids and I don't seem to get along. My spouse is onto my case. I'm not making as much money as I would have liked at this point in my career. I've messed up these other mistakes in my life. And over again, someone is reinforcing this pattern, this belief, I'm a failure. And so to the individual, this very strong connection that we've built is now a fact. So someone comes along, a family member, a friend, a loved one, or even a counselor, and says, I don't think that's true. I don't think you're a failure. But the individual doesn't believe it. They don't believe it because they have all this evidence, all this reinforcing going on in their brain that has told them, no, do you see this connection between these two things? It's very, very strong. I am a failure. And so they've taken an opinion, practiced it over and over again, and elevated it up to the degree of fact. And so simply telling someone that's just not true, you're not a failure, doesn't undo all of the practice that they've spent and put in reinforcing this thought. We can do this with any number of negative opinions of oneself. So I'm not good enough. I always mess up. I can't do this. Everything I touch falls apart. No one cares about me. These are all very negative opinions about oneself. And the problem is they're just not true. They're opinions. In fact, other people might think very differently about this individual in question. And so how do we change this? What do we do about the fact that many of us take opinions about ourselves and we treat them in our minds as though they are facts? It's an interesting observation. When it comes to fact and opinion, we are very good at identifying the difference between a fact and an opinion when it is external. But internally, we mix them up all the time. There's an activity I often do with children and teens where I will read them a series of sentences. And I will tell them, after each sentence, you need to tell me, is the sentence I just read a fact or an opinion? And the vast majority, all the way down to ages 6, 7, 8, can get 100% on that activity. They can externally decipher a statement as being fact or opinion. And yet, when it comes to statements about myself, we will hold on to negative opinions, once again, raising them and elevating them to the level of fact, as if this is a very true statement. And as we've demonstrated, we rewire our thinking by doing a couple things. Number one, I have to stop doing this. I have to stop enforcing, reinforcing, and practicing this negative thought habit. So something that I often say to people is this: if you believe you're a failure, could you at least accept the possibility that maybe you're wrong? Maybe you're not. That it's at least possible that other people don't see you as a failure. That it's at least possible that maybe you've taken some false evidence and information and held it up to the level of a fact. Can you at least open your mind to the possibility that maybe you've got this fact wrong? And if I can at least get someone to say, well, I can at least, it's possible. Maybe I'm wrong about this. Okay, then step one, let's stop this reinforcing process, because we've got to start to allow this old pattern of thought to atrophy and wither away. So let's stop reinforcing it. And in fact, let's identify the times when I start to think that I'm a failure. Why do I think that? Where did that come from? And so I want you to go throughout your day, and every time that thought, that negative opinion about yourself crops up, pops up into your thinking, I want you to identify it. And then more importantly, I want you to notice it, and I want you to not engage with it. I want you to say, no, that's not true. I'm not a failure. Or to say, at least, you know what, maybe I just made a mistake and that doesn't necessarily mean or equal that I am therefore a failure. Or maybe I start to unwire by saying some positive things about myself. I'm not a failure. There's people in my life who love me. I'm not a failure. I've done pretty good in my career. I'm not a failure. I've accomplished some really great things that I'm proud of. I'm not a failure. I've gone through some really hard things and I came out the other side. I'm not a failure because every day I get up and I face hard things and I keep moving forward. And each time we do this, we start to unwire and rewire our thinking so that eventually this neural pathway that was so strong and so connected that I've believed this opinion as a fact starts to unwire. It's a simple concept, fact and opinion. Most of us know the difference between the two, but the reality is, while we may be very good at identifying facts and opinions externally, we are often not very good at identifying them as they apply internally to ourselves. Well, as you can see, we're out of time in this video, so I want to encourage you once again. If anything stood out to you, share it with a family member, share it with a friend. If something stood out about yourself, maybe it's time to just talk to a counselor. Have an unbiased third party who can encourage you and walk you through this process of rewiring your thinking and helping you to get the concept of facts and opinions really solidified in your day-to-day thinking. Well, join us next week. We're going to start to shift gears in 10-minute therapy into a very different type of subject. So hang tight. Look forward to that. In the meantime, I'm Andrew with 10-Minute Therapy. God bless.